I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we are talking to one of the nation's preeminent biblical scholars, Sandy Miller, about her important literary work, a book called Rebuilding the Temple at Jerusalem, the Persian Empire's Influence in the Rebuilding of Jerusalem. And we are delighted to have Sandy back here as a guest on Spotlight. Welcome, Sandy.
Thank you.
Good to see you again. Happy to have you on the show. Last time we were talking about Revelation and the New Testament. Now we've gone back about 500 or 700 years or so, and we're talking about the Old Testament, right?
Right, right.
Tell me about your book and the importance of rebuilding the temple at Jerusalem.
Well, in the Old Testament time that my book talks about, the importance was that the temple had been destroyed by the Babylonian Empire, and it had been in ruins for over 70 years when the Persian Empire came to power. So when Cyrus the Great came to power, he decided that he believed that he was commissioned by God to rebuild the ruined temples, not just of the Jews, but the ruined temples of the whole empire, which included all sorts of religions. So he believed that his God had commissioned him to do that. So the Jews received their proclamation in Babylon, where they were exiled, and the proclamation said that any Jew who wanted to rebuild, to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, was free to do so, and that the Persian Empire would help with that. So that was the scene of the book.
And this is kind of the cradle of religion there in Jerusalem. You have Judaism, which I believe is the world's oldest religion, perhaps. That is their primary city, Jerusalem, is destroyed by the Babylonians. And you begin your book by talking about a Babylonian king by the name of Nebuchadnezzar, if I'm saying it correctly.
Yeah.
And he set out to burn and destroy over a period, I believe, of 3 decades, destroying Jerusalem. Tell me about that dark chapter in world history.
Well, the Jews had been getting into the worship of some of the gods of the land. The Mideastern people were into the worship of fertility gods. Mm-hmm. And fertility gods, they had a lot of customs that were foreign to the Jews, and but the Jews had been getting involved in that sort of thing. The fertility gods were they worshipped in hillside shrines, and they actually worshipped fertility, which fertility is important to the whole world. We all need more food, more crops that sow, and more animals to take care of our needs. So fertility has always been important. But it's in the Old Testament times, it was the worship of it was they used sacred prostitutes, both male and female, to recreate the act of fertility that would these prostitutes were in the place of the gods and goddesses of the land, and they promoted fertility by interacting with the people of the land. So some of their customs were when things got bad and rain didn't come and they needed rain and there was drought, they would often sacrifice a child. That was a Phoenician custom, and that by doing that they hoped to gain the favor of the gods, because a child was the most innocent and precious possession of the people, and they hoped to gain the favor of the gods by doing that.
So they had kind of adopted very barbaric routines at that point, employment of prostitutes, killing children. It had become kind of a uncivilized society, would you say?
That's right. And so the Jews believed that the gods punished, and so they were punished by the destruction of Jerusalem. Earlier, the Assyrians had destroyed other parts of Israel and exiled the people, and then Nebuchadnezzar came along and started harassing the cities and making raids on them. And after a while, then he destroyed the city. After a long siege, he destroyed the city and burned the temple.
And that's kind of a landmark in history when Jerusalem was destroyed, and what is called the first temple was destroyed as well, correct? Correct.
Yeah. So I kind of got interested in the type of angle that I took in my book when I realized, after watching a lot of local television about the world, that Iran was often in the news, and that Iran was the Persian Empire. And so I started looking into the Persian Empire and realizing that they had a big part in restoring Jerusalem, restoring Judah is the land of Israel. And what the land of Israel is today is, at least in part, because of the Persian Empire, which is, of course, today's Iran.
It's almost ironic, considering the tensions in the Middle East today, that you would have Persia, modern day Iran, rebuilding and restoring Israel and Judah.
Really, it is.
And the first temple.
Yeah, it is. And they were totally responsible, because Cyrus was the one that felt called to do that, even though Jerusalem wasn't the only temple, that the temple at Jerusalem wasn't the only temple that he destroyed. There was also, or that he rebuilt, there were also temples of all the gods and goddesses that he rebuilt in the whole area that was the Persian Empire. But the three kings over 100 years, over a 100-year period, were responsible for restoring the city of Jerusalem and the whole countryside that was in total ruins and had been lying in ruins for the whole 70-year period of the exile of the Jews in Babylon. So for 100 years, they took responsibility, even though it was Cyrus was the one that initiated it, but the other two Persian kings that were responsible were brought into it by trouble in the area and actually being brought into it by the puppet rulers of the Persian Empire, people that had been exiled into the area that were enemies of the uneducated Jewish people that had been left behind when the educated people and moneyed people were exiled to Babylon. The ones that were left behind were the people that wouldn't start any trouble for the Babylonians. And they also, the Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar, had exiled the enemies of the Jews into the area so that there wouldn't be any communication between them. They wouldn't have the same language. They would be enemies, and there wouldn't be any chance of them really getting together and starting trouble for the Babylonian Empire.
It almost reminds me of the Cultural Revolution when Mao took power, when he took the educated people and the wealthy people and the landowners and turned them basically into servants and slaves, and then elevated the people from the rural areas who were uneducated and who were not formidable opponents to his rule.
And he made them the rulers,
Exactly.
the uneducated people.
Exactly.
I didn't realize that. That's interesting. That really is interesting.
Yeah, I guess history does repeat itself, and despots do learn from other despots for sure. So Nebuchadnezzar was kind of hell-bent on destroying the Jews in many ways, seeing that they would never rebuild and they would never have their empire again.
Well, he was, although the educated people that were exiled in Babylon, they had a place of their own, sort of. The local people didn't really want to, the Persians didn't really want, or the Babylonians didn't really want to have anything to do with the Jews. So they had their own area, but they prospered. They built houses, had businesses. Actually, they maintained their own religion, which was quite remarkable in that they weren't anywhere near their temple, but they had priests that were exiled too, and they maintained their religion in the area, so that 70 years later, the Jews still were able to be a people that were together. So
Tell me about Cyrus. I'm presuming that he was not Jewish. I don't know what religion he was. Persia was not under the influence of Islam at that point. It was too early in the history, I believe, right?
Right. He actually, if you've heard of Zorro and the Zoroastrians, that was the religion that was powerful at that time. And one of the tenets of that religion was that the powers of light and the powers of darkness were in constant struggle with each other, and that the powers of light would win. So that was a winning, at the time, that was a winning religion. So that was something that the time was ready for. So
also interesting in your studies and in your work, you found out that Isaiah actually had prophecies where he foretold the coming of Cyrus, where he would rebuild Jerusalem. Tell me a little bit about those prophecies.
Well, I've got it right here in front of me in the book of Isaiah. It's 44, chapter 44, the last few verses. It says, this is what Isaiah prophesied about Cyrus. And he says, this is what the Lord says of Jerusalem. It shall be inhabited of the towns of Judah. They shall be built, and of their ruins I will restore them. Who says to the watery deep, be dry, and I will dry up your streams. Who says of Cyrus, now this was 200 years before Cyrus was born, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd and will accomplish all that I please. He will say of Jerusalem, let it be rebuilt, and of the temple, let its foundations be laid. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of, to subdue nations before him and to strip kings of their armor, to open doors before him so that gates will not be shut. I will go before you and will level the mountains. I will break down gates of bronze and cut through bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness, riches stored in secret places. So that's the prophecy that people talk about, that happened, that was prophesied 200 years before Cyrus was born. But Cyrus stepped in and took that place and carried out that prophecy.
That's pretty amazing. It's almost a little chilling that
It
by
is.
his very name, he was mentioned that he would restore the promised land, and he
Really?
did. And
It is.
Cyrus the Great was not aware of these prophecies, as far as I know, correct?
Right. I don't know that for sure, but I would assume that that's true.
Pretty amazing. When you discovered that, you must have gotten chills yourself, right?
I did. I think that's absolutely amazing. And when you teach the about it. The students are always amazed too. It is chilling.
Hmm. It's amazing that the Bible can be looked at and studied and analyzed and interpreted over and over again. And each time you look at it, you can find new meaning.
It is true. It's true.
Your coursework is studying the Bible as literature. Tell me a little bit about that approach and how it differs from theological studies or religious studies.
Well, actually, my approach is more teaching the Bible as cultural history.
Mhm.
The history of the Jews is really interesting. I mean, when you find out that for 500 years, before the time of Christ, the Mideast, the whole Mideast, not just the Jews, but the whole Mideast had been occupied by foreign troops, one after another, with no break in between. First, there was the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar and others. And then 70 years later, with no break, here came the Persians. And 200 and some years later, the Greeks under Alexander the Great. And then the Romans came when the Greeks started declining. The Romans stepped in, and of course, Augustus was the Caesar when Jesus was in, well, Augustus was in power when Jesus was a child. So anyway, I got diverted and got off the subject.
Oh, no worries, no worries. We were talking about you teaching the Bible as cultural literature, as a cultural phenomenon.
That is the making of Jesus, I think, and his disciples, because they had that background of continuous occupation. So they were never, except for a brief period of around 100 years when the Maccabees came to power, when things got so bad that Judas Maccabees actually stabbed someone who was trying to offer a pig on the altar of the Jews. So anyway, that was the cultural history behind the Jews. So
Very, very interesting. I also think it's interesting that 2,500 years later, or thereabouts, in 2017, President Trump actually intervened and recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital once again. I would think that is of great significance, correct?
Right. That's very significant.
And it also came about without any bloodshed, which was feared because many nations, many religions lay claim to Jerusalem, correct? Even till this day.
Oh, yeah, right.
It's a center of Christianity, it's a center of Islam, it's a center of Judaism.
Christianity. So anyway, teaching the Bible as cultural history is a very good way to teach it, because you take into consideration the cultural history which was in place which was the background of whatever story you're highlighting. And it's a really interesting way to study the Bible, because the Bible is totally influenced by the historical framework that it's set in. So
It's almost like being a constitutional scholar. You have to understand the historical context in order to understand the text itself, correct?
right,
Yeah,
that would certainly be true.
absolutely. Tell me about how your students and other people that you instruct have reacted to your book about the destruction of Jerusalem.
Well, my students have loved the story and found it very interesting, but I expected that there would be some more of a recognition of the fact that Iran was made up of the people from the Persian Empire, and that they were the culture that was responsible for the renewal of the restoration of Israel at that time period. I expected that there would be more interest in that, and I really haven't noticed that has been true. So,
Well, I certainly think it's significant. I think it's ironic. It's such a juxtaposition of what's happening right now. The fact that Cyrus and the kings that followed him realized the significance of Jerusalem and the temple is profound.
I think it is too. And that Cyrus was able to understand that all of those temples in the whole empire, which was extensive and included many, many nations and many languages and cultures, that there was as much need for the temple of the people that practiced the fertility rites and had sacred prostitutes. There was as much need for their temples as there was for the Jewish temples. I think that's kind of amazing that he not only restored the temple at Jerusalem, or was instrumental in it at any rate, but also he paid for, because he did pay for a lot of it himself out of the taxation of the Persian Empire. So I think that's amazing.
I do too. Obviously, it was a significant priority for him, and he gets credit for it, obviously. And I think sometimes it takes a while for the aspects of certain discoveries or certain revelations to have their full impact. But I think certainly eventually people will realize that there is quite a lesson to be learned in the fact that Persia and the Persian people rebuilt the temple at Jerusalem and Jerusalem itself. Tell me a little bit about your great, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, I'm sorry, not just Jerusalem, the city, but the country, that Judah, the land of Judah, and no doubt the land, I suppose some of the land of Israel, which was inhabited by the Samaritans, which were enemies really of Jews in that time frame. So anyway, that was significant.
Yeah, it's a truly significant event. Now, you break the book up into lectures. Was this book developed during your years of teaching that you compiled lectures? Tell me a little bit about the writing process.
Well, it was. I started writing for my classes in Northwest Florida. I was teaching the Bible as literature there for several years. And then when I moved to Naples, I kept teaching the Bible as cultural history, which is about the same type of background. Anyway, when I was ready to do a book of the Bible, I'd look into it and really, after I read it, any questions I had, I followed up on them and didn't allow myself to be detoured by, or tried not to allow myself to be detoured by my own belief system. And I tried to follow where the questions led. And as I did this, I realized how interesting the Bible is and how much history there is behind it, because I'd follow up the cultural history of the time period, and it was always a very interesting process, and I loved finding all that information out. And then when I presented it to my students, they liked it too. They loved it, and discussion was a big part of the class, and so they gave me a lot of feedback, and I strengthened my courses by using their feedback. And it was, over all those years, I've got a library of courses that are ready to be made books at any time because they're already in book form. And the books that I write are really discussion guides. You take the lecture, and then there's a lot of discussion about all the points of the lecture, and then that creates the book. So
Absolutely. Well, they're fascinating books. I truly enjoyed it. I truly enjoyed your study questions at the end of each chapter. They're provocative. They made you think. The name of the book is Rebuilding the Temple at Jerusalem, the Persian Empire's Influence in the Rebuilding of Jerusalem by Sandy Miller. And the short take on this story is that way back before the time of Christ, 500 years or so before the time of Christ, what is now Iran rebuilt Israel. And that's a fascinating headline. It's a fascinating book. It's a scholarly book that's easily read. And I highly recommend it. You can get it on Amazon. You can download it to your Kindle like I did, or you can pick up a physical copy. Sandy Miller, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
well, thank you, Logan, and thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
My pleasure. I enjoyed having you as a guest as well. I found it enlightening. And to the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.